Why do some startups change the world while others don't? That's the question that Mike Maples Jr. asks in his new book, Pattern Breakers. Mike is the seed investor behind successful startups like Lyft, Twitch, and Okta. And in Pattern Breakers, he lays out practical, concrete strategies that startups can use to create ideas for revolutionary products. If you're a founder developing an idea for a new product, these strategies are gold. And that's why we're naming Pattern Breakers our 2024 Book of the Year. Keep watching to learn 4 strategies from Pattern Breakers that you can use right now to build products that change the world. I'm Scott Kim, puzzle designer and co-founder of Game Thinking. I've worked on hits like Bejeweled, Mastering Math, and Tetris, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. When I read Pattern Breakers, it helped me connect the dots and understand how a good idea can turn into a global success. Take the Russian game Tetris, designed by my longtime friend and colleague Alexei Pajitnov. It's a great game, but it takes more than a great game or product to create a breakthrough hit. Which brings us to strategy number 1, inflections. An inflection is a sudden change in technology, society, or governance that unlocks a power that the world has never seen. As Mike says,
a startup needs to have a weapon to fight unfair. Inflections are the way that the startup wages asymmetric warfare on the present. So like Lyft is a company we invested in. The inflection was that the iPhone 4S had a GPS locator chip in it. And so all of a sudden, there was a new type of empowerment available. You could locate people algorithmically within 1 meter. And so this is why I call it an inflection and not a trend. There was a turning point in empowerment. The day before the iPhone 4S, you couldn't have had ride sharing, but the day after, the conditions now existed for the possibility of a radical breakthrough.
Inflections often create conditions that favor startups because they're faster and more nimble than large established companies. For instance, traditional taxi companies couldn't move fast enough to take advantage of the iPhone because they were locked into a business model based on managing their own fleet of drivers, and they lacked the technological infrastructure to create a flexible, on-demand platform. That left room for tech-savvy startups like Uber and Lyft to take advantage of the inflection. Now let's look at the success of Tetris, which took advantage of both a technology inflection and a social inflection. Back in 1989, Nintendo introduced the Game Boy, a handheld console that opened up an entirely new market for games. This new platform needed games that could be played by everyone. Alexei's partner Hank Rogers saw an opportunity and convinced Nintendo that this new game from Russia could be a winner. So when the Game Boy launched, it came bundled with Tetris, and both became huge hits. 1989 was also when the Iron Curtain fell, ushering in a new era of positive relations with Russia. So Tetris was marketed as a game from Russia, complete with Russian artwork. To this day, the theme song immediately brings to mind these Russian roots. But inflections don't stand alone, and that brings us to strategy number 2, insights. An insight is some non-obvious truth about how an inflection unlocks a desirable new capability. As Mike says,
when I'm doing a seed investment, I'm not investing in the product. The product is a reference implementation of the insight. What I care about is the insight and the authenticity of the founders to pursue that insight and their capabilities to start a movement that will make that insight real. I have to count on their ability to navigate the insight to the correct product over time by noticing things and by finding surprises and integrating it into their strategy.
The best way to discover an authentic insight is to start living in the future and then notice what's missing. Like Justin Kahn, who built himself a rig in 2007 for live streaming his life 24/7. It was a strange idea at the time, but by living in a future where live streaming was commonplace, he gained insight into what you could do with live streaming. And 4 years later, Justin and his co-founders launched Twitch, which became a massive success. Together, inflections and insights can power radical change. Mike calls this idea inflection theory. Consider Tetris in 1989. The Game Boy was the inflection, and Hank's insight was that Tetris was the perfect launch title for the Game Boy. It was appealing to a wide variety of gamers, and critically, it worked well on a tiny screen controlled by just a few buttons. So he made a licensing deal with Nintendo and took a hair-raising trip to Russia to secure rights to the game, as dramatized in the Apple TV movie Tetris. Once Tetris was established as a hit, the Tetris team developed more games based on the core mechanics, and we refined our ideas by building low-fidelity prototypes. Which leads us to strategy number 3, tangible prototypes. This is how you turn your insight into the right product.
You don't actually have to have an MVP. What you're trying to do is simulate the value proposition enough so that the customer can reveal their desperation. It's like when you go to a car show and you see a concept car. If you open the hood, there's not actually an engine. And if you turn the key in the ignition, it doesn't start. But that's not why they do it. They want to see if people crowd around this car or if they just walk on by. And if a bunch of people crowd around the car, they're like, we should build this car.
Remember, the purpose of a prototype is to test a specific aspect of your product idea, not to start building your final product. Prototypes should be cheap and fast to build, so you don't mind throwing them away if they fail. For example, when I worked on the next Tetris, I made quick sketches of many different puzzle ideas on paper, so I could pick the best ones before I spent time implementing them in code. Now, as a product design coach, I've found that a great way to prototype and test your customer's experience is with 30-day concept storyboards. These sketches let you quickly learn what your customers like and don't like about your product idea without writing a single line of code. And it turns out that who you show your prototypes to matters. Which brings us to strategy number 4, early believers. Mike recommends that you focus on delighting your early believers before pursuing your total addressable market.
A great startup is an optimistic conspiracy to change the future. And the future is created not just by the startup, it's co-created by the startup and its early believers. And so the early believers can include early employees, it can include early customers, early partners, even early investors. You're starting a movement. You don't want everybody to like your idea. What you want is most people to not care, most people to dislike it, but a small subset of the world to be like, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life?
We call these early believers superfans. Superfans are the people who are actively trying to solve the problem that your product addresses. Superfans can give you great feedback on your product concept, and after your product launches, they can become your evangelists. So do you have to have all these things in place to have a hit product? Of course not, and Mike would be the first to agree. But they do increase your odds of success, and when you're trying to survive in a competitive marketplace, you need every advantage you can get. Inflection theory helps us understand why Tetris was the right game at the right moment. It came bundled with the Game Boy, and it emerged at a time of increased interest in Russian culture. That combination of elements propelled Tetris to become a global hit that's still going strong 40 years later. So remember,
business is never a fair fight. And so the question is, how do we want to show up in the world in such a way that the incumbents are like, oh my gosh, how do I deal with this wildly disruptive thing from left field? If all the incumbents are dinosaurs, we want to be like an asteroid that hits the earth, and now the only thing that's left is mammals, and we're the mammals.
If you want to put these ideas into practice, we made you a cheat sheet. Go to gamethinking.io/patternbreakers to download it now. If this video was helpful to you, please give it a like. It really helps out the channel. Want to hear more stories about my time working with Alexi and Hank? Let me know in the comments below. Let's get smarter together. See you soon.